Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So, coming to you again from the San Jose State office. Today, I want to talk to you about Robert Kraut's influential article on jazz and language, and this is excerpted from his Why Does Jazz Matter to Aesthetic Theory? So, Kraut begins by noting he quotes a famous jazz musician by the name of Martino, Pat Martino, specifically. He's a jazz guitarist. Quote, I find that certain students have trouble perceiving music only because of the language. If they were shown that music is a language, like any other language, they'd realize it's only couched in different symbols. Then possibly they would understand that they knew things already inherently, right? So, as Kraut notes, right, Martino's view that music is a language like any other language is widespread among jazz musicians. But, as he also notes, aestheticians, philosophers of art, tend to balk at that suggestion to a certain extent, right? They point out that, well, look, jazz, music in general, right, but doesn't have a syntax, which is to say a grammatical structure, or a semantics, which is to say a vocabulary, like a language does, a natural language. And that would seem to disqualify jazz from being a kind of language. But even if that's the case, even if it is the case that language or the jazz is not directly analogous to a language, isn't a language, nevertheless, that metaphor, that analogy on Kraut's view has a lot of value. How can that be? Well, as he notes, this is page 235. The hypothesis that art is language-like prompts valuable analogies between artist intentions, right, and speaker intentions. It prompts fruitful analogies between the art world and the linguistic community. It prompts questions about translational indeterminacy, about whether there exists a unique, correct interpretation of a work of art. That's a very good question, right? Very tough question to answer. And whether there are facts of the matter to which correct artistic interpretations must conform. All such inquiries and analogies, whatever their upshot, are of tremendous theoretical value, insofar as they are encouraged by focus upon the dialogical nature of jazz. Jazz matters to aesthetic theory. So what does Kraut mean by the dialogical theory? Well, many musicians, and not just in jazz, but particularly in jazz, given its improvisational nature. So jazz, in that respect, is a lot like a conversation. You improvise as you go, right? Conversations typically aren't pre-planned, and if they are, that pre-planned structure doesn't last long. But that's the dialogue. That's the dialogical part of it that he's making reference to, right? A jazz performance is kind of a compromise. It's an improvised, is a better word, performance between multiple musicians, and it's fascinating because that improvisational nature, not having a formal structure or a set song when you go into the performance, right, would seem like a recipe for disaster. But jazz musicians are particularly adept at holding such a structure together and moving very well and weaving in and out of these complex chord changes and melodic structures. So that gives credence to the jazz as a kind of language hypothesis, right? But still, there's the concerns, right? Well, look, the analogy really doesn't hold up under scrutiny, right? For example, here on page 236, Kraut writes, and let's quote this at length: the analogies have their limits. The entire artist language model strains not only at our sense of language, but also at our sense of art. It is not clear, for example, that understanding futurist paintings requires syntactic parsing and or semantic evaluation. It rather requires seeing those works as efforts to capture a sense of sequential movement, mechanical power, and the dynamism of modern life. It is not clear that Rene Magritte's surrealist paintings are best construed as statements in a painterly language. Better to see them as efforts to induce feelings of strangeness and wonderment by importing familiar objects into unfamiliar contexts. It is not clear that Art Deco buildings in the 1920s were best construed as statements in a language of space, volume, and massing. better to see them as efforts to maximize floor-to-area ratios while conforming to various zoning ordinances and design requirements. In each such case, it seems most helpful to view artistic creation not as a species of linguistic behavior, but rather as a species of problem-solving behavior. That is, as artistic attempts to solve certain kinds of problems. All right, well, what kind of problem are we trying to solve when we use jazz then, right? Well, as he notes a few lines down, the theoretical interest of jazz is that it strikes so many performers and sophisticated observers as a form of discursive practice, thereby rendering more urgent the theorists' need to explain these art as language ways of speaking. Okay, but what's the payoff? What's the value for it? Why is then jazz, as Kraut so often mentions throughout the article, why is it important to aesthetics? So here at the top of page 237, he notes, right, the theorist might proceed by articulating a general notion of languagehood equally applicable to natural languages like English, formal languages like formal logic, and artistic genres. Or alternatively, she or he might undertake an elaborate explanation of why at least some artistic genres are consistently regarded, if incorrectly, as linguistic, while maintaining a contrast between art forms and genuinely linguistic practices. Either way, there is theoretical work to be done. Jazz matters to aesthetic theory by underscoring the urgency of such work. So, in short, right, jazz shows us that our understanding of what it is to be an art form, right, is incomplete because it bears some similarities, not all the hallmarks, mind you, but it bears similarities to language, right? Kraut doesn't talk about this, but I, for my part, I think it's interesting to consider the possibility that whereas the language metaphor is a bit incomplete, it's not wholly accurate, still jazz does resemble a language insofar as there's something clearly we're trying to convey something, and we're trying to convey something in a way that involves if not a grammar, if not a syntax, right, and semantics, certainly a form of regular and consistent communication. So I'll let Kraut here have the last word. Jazz matters to aesthetic theory by foregrounding, the need to take seriously the dialogical art as language paradigm, to explain its prevalence and explain its utility. The art world is a complicated place. If jazz encourages a paradigm that provides direction for approaching some of its complexities, so much the better.